Let's start with a simple question. You are a human being. You have, through no effect of your own, been born into a world that contains beaches, mountains, forests, lakes, restaurants, television, and an essentially infinite supply of things to do that do not involve crawling headfirst into a hole in the ground, right? You have options. Good ones, an embarrassment of them, really. And yet, every year, tens of thousands of people look at the surface of the earth and decide it just isn't enough, and they need to go underneath it. So they strap on their helmets sometimes and knee pads sometimes and haul themselves through passages barely wide enough for a human body, scraping through limestone in the dark, squeezing past rocks that have been waiting in the same position since before there were humans to squeeze past them, descending into systems so deep and so vast that the sun becomes a theoretical concept rather than an experienced reality. And some of them even do this with scuba tanks, navigating flooded tunnels where the only thing between them and drowning is a cylinder of compressed gas and their own spatial awareness. Sounds terrifying on top of something that's already terrifying. And some of them do it for days at a time, camping underground at temperatures that hover just above freezing, using the bathroom in a bag because there was no other option, and just sleeping on rock. And they do this voluntarily, mind you. For fun, on the weekends, because why not? But there is a version of this that makes a certain kind of sense. Because the Earth is genuinely spectacular from the inside, with cathedral chambers hung with formations that took 1 million years to grow, and underground rivers running through passages no human eye has ever seen, ecosystems so isolated from the surface that the creatures living in them have spent millennia losing their eyes because there was nothing down there worth looking at anyway. And cavers and cave divers have mapped systems stretched hundreds of kilometers and discovered species entirely new to science, and documented geological features that rewrite our understanding of how water moves through rock. It is real exploration in an era when real exploration has become almost impossible to find. The last genuinely unknown places on Earth are not at its edge, they are underneath it. But then there is the other version. The version where one wrong turn, one equipment failure, one unexpected shift in rock above you converts a recreational activity into a situation from which no emergency service on Earth can reliably extract you. And that is terrifying. And the warning signs posted at the entrances to the world's most popular cave diving sites are not the performative legal disclaimers you find on trampolines and ski slopes. They are body counts, grim reapers drawn in marker on laminated plastic with numbers beneath them, specific numbers with often names attached. And we are going to talk about 3 of those names. And they were not careless or ignorant or cavalier. They were experienced, thoughtful, and fully aware of the risks they were accepting. And they would go anyway. And the caves would take them anyway, with the complete indifference that the underground world has always applied equally to the prepared and the unprepared, the expert and the novice. Because at the end of the day, caves don't care who you are, and they never have, and they never will. And these individuals were, unfortunately, about to experience this firsthand. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, or welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Call Me Chris, you can call me Chris, and today we're getting into something a bit darker, not necessarily true crime or anything, but it's just, I find cave diving and spelunking extremely interesting and why people do it. But we're gonna focus on these 3 people specifically and their stories and who they were. So without further ado, let's get into it. There is a photograph of Dave Shaw, taken sometime in his 40s, that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He is grinning with the wide, slightly goofy grin of a person who is genuinely, almost embarrassingly happy to be exactly where he is. That was Dave Shaw, a big Australian with an even bigger laugh. The kind of man who made rooms feel warmer just by walking into them. Now, Dave was born on July 20th, 1954 in Katanning, a small wheat belt town in Western Australia. And he grew up as most Australian boys of that era did. Outdoors, sunburnt, physical, unafraid of discomfort. And he eventually became a commercial airline pilot for Cathay Pacific, flying 747s out of Hong Kong, which tells you something about his temperament. The kind of person who is not only comfortable with enormous responsibility, but who actively seeks it out, who feels most alive when the stakes are real and the margins are thin. But he and his wife Anne settled in Hong Kong with their 2 children, and by all accounts, their marriage was one of those rare ones that actually looked as good from the inside as it did from the outside. And Anne described him as her best friend. She called him her anchor. And he didn't actually start diving until his late 30s, an almost laughably late entry point for someone who would go on to do what he did. But Dave Shaw just had a way of accelerating through things that took other people decades. And within a few years, he had moved through recreational diving, technical diving, and into closed-circuit rebreather diving, the most demanding form of the sport, using a device that recirculates and chemically scrubs exhaled gas rather than venting it as bubbles, allowing for far longer dives at far greater depths. So by the early 2000s, he was operating at a level that placed him among a handful of divers on Earth, capable of going where almost no one had gone before. And that's when he would find Bushman's Hole through the community of extreme technical divers that orbits the deepest sites on Earth like a very small, very intense solar system. And everyone in that world knew about Bozeman's Gat. Now, Bozeman's Gat, Bushman's Hole, sits in the northern Cape of South Africa, in a dry, sun-cracked landscape near the town of Daniel School that looks more like the surface of Mars than anywhere you'd expect to find water. And from above, it's easy to miss, a rough oval of algae-covered water maybe 40 meters across, sitting in a shallow ancient crater ringed by scrubby thorn trees. There is nothing about it from the surface that suggests what lies beneath. But what lies beneath is a narrow vertical shaft dropping about 45 meters before opening suddenly, without warning, into one of the largest underwater chambers ever discovered. And the walls just kind of fall away, and the floor disappears. And the space is so vast that divers have described the moment of entry as something close to vertigo, the sensation of stepping off a ledge into open sky rather than rock. Again, I'm good. But the chamber is roughly cathedral-sized at the top and continues widening as it descends, finally bottoming out approximately 283 meters, just over 927 feet below the surface. And the water is fresh, clear, and cold. And there is no current, but there also is no light below the first 30 meters. And there is, by the time you reach the bottom, essentially nothing connecting you to the living world except a line, a tank, and your own nerve. So by the time Dave Shaw came to know it, Bozeman's Gat had already claimed a man, and his name was Dion Dreyer. Now, he was 20 years old, born August 7th in 1974 in Vereeniging, and by all accounts, he was a bright, energetic young South African who had developed a passion for adventure diving, and young enough that he had accumulated roughly 200 dives by the time he was invited in December of 1994 to join a support team at Bozeman's Gat for a deep expedition led by South African diver Nuno Gomes. Now, Dion was not there as a deep diver. He was there to assist, surface support, shallow relay, the kind of role that is essential to any technical diving operation, but that keeps you well away from the serious depths. Now, that dive was on December 17th, 1994. And at some point during his own preparation dive, at approximately 50 meters, Dion Dreyer lost consciousness. And the most likely cause was oxygen toxicity or CO2 buildup, the kinds of physiological ambush that, in a pool, result in a saved swimmer, and in a submerged cave, result in a death. So his body would sink, and it would just keep sinking. Down through the narrowing shaft past the point where the walls fell away, into that vast dark cathedral below. And by the time recovery divers could safely operate, Dion Dreyer had come to rest somewhere near the bottom of the deepest freshwater cave dive site on the African continent. And a mining ROV eventually found his helmet at the bottom, not his body though. Just his helmet sitting in the silt at the bottom of the 283 meters of cold, dark water, as if he simply set it down and walked somewhere else. And his family placed a memorial plaque at the cave entrance. So every diver who came to Bozeman's Gat in the years that followed passed that plaque. And Dion Dreyer lay somewhere in the darkness below. And his family lived with a particular agony of grief that has no body to bury, no grave to visit, and no tangible ending. And his father, Theo, kept hope, or something that looked like hope, that one day someone would bring his son home. And for 10 years, no one did, because no one could. So Dave Shaw descended to Bozeman's Gat for the first time in 2004. And he had been diving seriously for about 5 years by then, which, in the world of extreme technical cave diving, made him both a newcomer and, given the pace of his progression, a phenomenon, basically. Because he was meticulous and he was prepared obsessively. Because he treated every dive as an engineering problem to be solved before it became a survival problem. And his dive partner for that Bozeman's Gat project was Don Shirley, a British-born South African diver who was, if anything, even more technically rigorous than Shaw. A man who would later describe his approach to deep diving as, quote, doing everything I can to reduce the possibility of death to as close to zero as possible, unquote. So on October 28, 2004, Dave Shaw descended to 270 meters at Bozeman's Gat, setting 4 depth records simultaneously, which is crazy. He just started, including the deepest scuba dive on the African continent. But what makes this dive remarkable isn't just its depth, it's what happened when he got there. Because most record divers, at the moment of achieving their target depth, do essentially what runners do at the finish line. They touch it and turn around. Because the bottom of a record dive is not a place to linger. Your gas consumption at depth is punishing, and your decompression obligation is climbing with every second. And the physiological hazards of extreme depth, like nitrogen narcosis, high-pressure nervous syndrome, and oxygen toxicity, make the deepest moments of the dive the most dangerous. And you go, you note the depth, and you just ascend. So you touch, and then you just go up. But Dave Shaw swam along the bottom because he thought he had time and he had curiosity. And those two things together took him approximately 50 feet laterally across the bottom of the chamber. And there, in the beam of his light, perfectly preserved in the cold, still, dark water, was Dion Dreyer, lying on his back, arms reaching up toward the surface that was 283 meters away, with his mask still in place. A decade of submersion had reduced much of him to skeleton, but what remained was unmistakable, suspended in the silt like a figure from a painting. A young man frozen mid-reach, pointing at the sky. But Dave Shaw came back to the surface and thought about what he had seen for 2 straight days. Then he picked up the phone and called Theo Dreyer, which was the deceased man's father. And he would tell him, quote, "I will go and fetch your son," unquote. And what followed was 6 months of preparation so thorough it bordered on the obsessive. And Shaw assembled an 8-person relay team that would be staged at intervals throughout the cave, forming a kind of human chain from the surface to the bottom. And Don Shirley would accompany him as deep as was safe, because the logistics of the lift were war-gamed extensively. Because Dion's body had been underwater for 10 years, which meant significant physiological changes, the specifics of which were difficult to predict but needed to be accounted for. And Shaw designed a body bag tailored to the dimensions, and he practiced the bagging procedure repeatedly in open water with a weighted mannequin. And Anne Shaw, his wife, sewed the body bag herself at his request. And a filmmaker named Gordon Hiles designed a helmet-mounted camera for the dive so the recovery could be documented. And this was new equipment, untested in this configuration. and the camera's mounting displaced the canister light that Shaw normally wore in a specific practice position. So he had to reroute the light cable over his shoulder instead of its usual path. So it was a small change, the kind of thing that in isolation seems entirely manageable. So everything was tested and everything was checked meticulously. And the team was extremely experienced and the planning was exhaustive. And Dave Shaw was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable people on Earth to attempt this dive. So on the evening of January 7th, 2005, the team gathered at Bozeman's Gat. And the mood, by multiple accounts, was positive and focused. And Shaw was calm. And he slept well that night. And Theo and Mary Dreyer were there because they have waited 10 years for this moment. So on January 8th, 2005, at 6:13 a.m., Dave Shaw shook Don Shirley's hand and he would say, quote unquote, "I'll see you in 20 minutes." And that's when he would enter the water. Now, the descent through the upper shaft of Bozeman's Gat takes approximately 11 minutes. And in that shaft, there is still some ambient light filtering down from the surface. A dim greenish glow that fades as you drop. But by the time you pass 80 meters, there's nothing. Only the beam of your own light cutting a white cone into water that is, at this depth and temperature, completely transparent and completely empty in every direction that beam doesn't reach, which is horrifying. Just a black abyss, essentially. So at some point in those 11 minutes of descent, the vast chamber opened below him and around him, and he would have felt it more than he would have seen it. A change in the geometry of the dark, a sense of space expanding. The walls of the shaft fell away, and the beam of his light no longer caught rock on either side. He was in the cathedral, and he found Dion Dreyer exactly where he had left him. And what Shaw encountered next was the thing that no amount of preparation had fully accounted for, because no amount of preparation could have. And Dion Dreyer's body was not, as expected, negatively buoyant, just heavy with the density of a decade underwater, because 10 years of submersion had triggered a process called adipocere formation, in which human fat converts to a waxy soap-like substance that is resistant to further decomposition. And adipocere is buoyant. Dion Dreyer's body, disturbed from the silt where it had rested for a decade, did not stay at the bottom. It drifted upward, so Shaw tried to make it work, and the helmet camera recorded everything. And from that footage that would later be analyzed by the team, you can see him struggling to get the body into the bag. An already difficult procedure made significantly harder by the unpredicted buoyancy, the cold and depth, and the time pressure. And then, something went wrong with the equipment. And the body bag lines entangled with the cable of his light, the one that had been rerouted over his shoulder to accommodate the helmet camera. And the exact sequence is impossible to reconstruct with certainty, but the footage shows Shaw's movements becoming increasingly urgent. And you see him cutting at something, and he is working faster, and his breathing, audible on the recording, is getting harder, faster inhalations and less complete exhalations, the respiratory pattern of a person who is working very hard or beginning to panic, or both. And at exactly 26 minutes into the dive, Shaw had told Don Shirley he'd be back in 20, all movement in the footage stops, but the camera is still running. And the light is still on, but Dave Shaw is now motionless. And Don Shirley, descending from his staging position, arrived at 220 meters and looked into the deepest part of the cave. And he could see one light far below, and it was not moving, so he would wait, but it still wouldn't move. So he wrote on his dive slate and passed it upward through the relay chain, diver to diver, through the dark water, up through the shaft toward the pale green glow of the surface. And on the slate, it would say, "Dave is not coming back." And the slate would reach the surface, and Theo and Mary Dreyer were standing at the water's edge. Don Shirley's ascent was its own ordeal, because he had been deep, and he had been longer than planned, and his decompression obligation was severe. He spent the next several hours making mandatory decompression stops on his way back up, physically ill and emotionally just destroyed, completely alone in the dark water. And he later described it as the longest hours of his life. And 3 days later, the team returned to retrieve their equipment and lines from the cave. And as they began hauling on Shaw's descent line, something came with it. 2 bodies, entangled together, rising slowly through the water. And in his final minutes, in those 26 minutes of struggling, cutting, working in the cold dark at 270 meters with his air running low and his light entangled, Dave Shaw had apparently succeeded in getting Dion Dreyer into that body bag, or at least sufficiently free from the silt and tethered to the line, that when the line was eventually retrieved, Dreyer came with it. Because the buoyancy that had complicated the recovery also ultimately completed it. And both men would come up together as if unwilling to make the final journey separately. And Dave Shaw had promised Theo Dreyer he would bring his son home, and he would keep that promise. And Anne Shaw was told that her husband's body was coming up, and she had sewn the bag he was supposed to bring Dion home in, and she had watched him go into the water that morning. And she would later say of the dive and of the man, quote, "If there weren't people like David, we'd still be driving around in horse and carts," unquote. And she meant it without bitterness and without performance. That was simply who he was to her. Someone who went to the places other people wouldn't go for reasons other people couldn't quite understand, but perhaps recognized as important. Dave Shaw was 50 years old at the time of his death, and he was buried in Australia. And Dion Dreyer was buried by his family in South Africa in March of 2005. 10 years, 2 months, and 19 days after he sank to the bottom of Bozeman's Gut. And that brings us to our next story. John Edward Jones was 26 years old in November of 2009. And by any measure, he was a man whose life was going exactly the way life was supposed to go. He had graduated from BYU, and he was in his second year of medical school at the University of Virginia, with the aspiration to become a pediatric cardiologist, a career choice that tells you something about a person. He wanted to heal children's hearts. The most selfless thing you could do, essentially. So he had already found his calling, and his calling was quiet and careful and life-preserving. And he would marry Emily in 2006, and they would go on to have a daughter and name her Lizzie. And Emily was pregnant with their second child now, a boy they planned to name Josh after John's younger brother. Now, John came from a large, close-knit Mormon family in Utah, the kind of family that fills an entire section of folding chairs at school events and whose group texts require a dedicated phone plan. And he was the kind of older brother who showed up for camping trips, for late-night phone calls, for exactly the kind of pre-Thanksgiving cave adventure that his brother Josh proposed in late November of 2009. Now, John had caved as a kid, tagging along on family excursions into the limestone hills south of Salt Lake City. So he wasn't an expert by any means, and he wasn't even particularly experienced as an adult, but he was fit, and he was game. And Nutty Putty Cave was, by reputation, the kind of place where groups of reasonably fit young men went to squeeze through tight passages and come out the other side with mud on their faces and a good story. And it had been open to the public for decades, and it had a reservation system. It had names for its passages: the Birth Canal, the Scout Eater, the Big Slide. I hate all of these names, by the way. Just slightly ominous names that popular caves accumulate over years of guided tours and youth group trips. And it was, in the vernacular of recreational caving, a beginner to intermediate site. So very fitting for the level that John was at. But John was 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds, on the heavier side for serious caving, where the sport has a way of selecting for the lean and the narrow. But Nutty Putty wasn't serious caving. Nutty Putty was essentially just an adventure. So on the evening of November 24th, 2009, John, his brother, Josh, and 9 friends drove to the cave entrance near Alberta, Utah, 55 miles south of Salt Lake City. And the plan was simple. Go in, navigate some tight passages, find the famous birth canal squeeze, turn around, come back. So they would enter in the early evening. And they had flashlights and enthusiasm and the reasonable confidence of a group of people who have done the reading and figure they know what they're getting into. But at some point after descending the big slide, a 45-degree sloping room deep in the cave, John and Josh split from the main group to find that birth canal on their own. Now, the birth canal was a well-known, well-traveled passage in walls polished smooth by thousands of bodies that had wriggled through it over the years. And the polish itself was essentially the map. That's kind of how you knew where to go. Wherever it was smooth, that's where you were supposed to go. Follow the marks that other people's bodies have left. Kind of like a trail on a path. Whatever's like pounded down, that's the path you take. And ideally, you will be fine. But John would find a hole. And it was approximately 8 feet from the entrance to the birth canal, and it looked right. And it was roughly the same size, roughly the same shape, in roughly the same direction. And he'd done the reading, and he knew what to look for. So he went in head first. But the passage he entered was called Ed's Push. And it was not polished, and it was not well-traveled. And it was an unmapped, rarely explored dead-end fissure that very few people had ever voluntarily entered, and that had almost certainly never been entered by anyone built like John Edward Jones. Because it narrowed immediately, and then it steepened. First to 40 degrees, then to 50, then steeper than that, past the angle where your body weight begins to work against you, until he was descending at something close to 70 degrees head first into a crack in the limestone that measured 10 inches wide and 18 inches tall. An extremely tight space for a 6-foot man who is 200 pounds. And at that point, at that 70-degree angle, head first in 10 by 18 inches, he realized he could no longer move forward. So he stopped moving and he tried to shimmy back out, but he couldn't. And his feet were pointing at the ceiling essentially at this point, and his head was pointing at the floor. And the rock was pressing against him from both sides and from behind. And gravity, the one force in physics that never takes a day off, was doing everything it could to push him further in. Now, Josh found him minutes later, his brother, navy and black running shoes sticking out of a hole in the wall. And he grabbed his brother's ankles and started to pull, and John would slide back just a little bit, but then he would slide forward again. And Josh would pull a little bit harder and the rock would hold. And then John would say, "Go get him, brother," in terms of going to get help, because Josh could not get him out of that hole alone. So Josh went. The rescue operation that followed was one of the largest cave rescue efforts in Utah history. 137 rescuers ultimately responded, drawn from search and rescue teams, fire departments, and caving organizations across the state. And the first responders arrived within hours. And the problem they faced was immediately and horribly clear. John Edward Jones was in a passage that only one person could access at a time, head down at a steep enough angle that the blood was pooling in his upper body, in a crack too narrow to maneuver in and too solid to quickly enlarge. Just the most claustrophobic feeling you could ever feel. So the first rescuer to reach him was Susie Matola, a trained cave rescuer who navigated the narrow passage to John's feet and then had to essentially hang above him in the inverted space, working blind and communicating by voice. And she cut away his jeans to reduce friction and bulk, and she got an IV line into him as well, and she gave him water. And in the hours that followed, she talked to him about religion, about his family, about anything that kept him present and focused and calm. I can't even imagine the amount of panic you'd be feeling if you were stuck in a hole in the ground. And she would even hum hymns to him, and he talked back. And at this point, his voice was strong. And the engineers rigged a rope and pulley mechanical advantage system, a set of anchors and lines designed to multiply the pulling force applied to John's feet. And on the surface and in the passages above, rescuers heaved, and John moved, slowly, inches at a time. But he did move. So the system was working, and the mood briefly lifted. And then one of the anchor bolts failed, and John would drop back down, possibly further than he was before. And the brief vertical gain reversed itself completely, and now the team was looking at the very real possibility that they had made things worse. Drills were now brought in, and the plan shifted to enlarging the passage itself, cutting into the rock surrounding him to create enough space to extract him. And it took an hour and a half to cut through 6 inches of limestone. 6 inches. I can't even imagine how he's feeling at this moment. But they would lower a 2-way radio so John could speak to Emily. And she was on the surface, pregnant in Utah in November, talking to her husband for a walkie-talkie while he hung upside down in a crack in the earth. And what they said to each other is not public record. And by the second night of the operation, John's voice started to change, and it had become nasal, slightly slurred, because fluid was accumulating in his lungs from the prolonged inversion, and his body was slowly filling from the inside. And he was starting to drift, and he talked in his semi-conscious moments about seeing angels and demons. And he lost track of how long he had been down there and told one rescuer he thought it had been 2 days. And he had been there for perhaps 20 hours at this point. So he was not wrong about what was happening to him. He knew. And Brandon Kowalas was the last rescuer to reach him. And he was a caving expert who had been involved in the operation from early on. And he assessed the situation as, in his words, quote unquote, pretty much impossible. And he stayed with John as long as he could, and then he would come back up. And at 11:52 p.m. on November 25th, 2009, 27 hours and some minutes after John Jones had pushed headfirst into the wrong hole, rescuers on the surface confirmed what people in the cave already knew: cardiac arrest and positional asphyxia. The blood had pooled in his head and chest for more than a day, and had done what blood does when gravity gets to work on it long enough. The body stiffened quickly in the cold of the cave, and extraction was no longer possible. And not practically, not safely, not without risks to the rescuers that no one was willing to ask them to take. And the family made a decision, and they asked that John be left where he was. On December 9th, 2009, 2 weeks after his death, workers used controlled explosive to collapse the ceiling of Ed's push. And then they sealed the entire entrance to Nutty Putty Cave with concrete. And the cave has been closed ever since. And a small plaque marks the former entrance, and below it, exactly where he came to rest. John Edward Jones remains. And Emily Jones would give birth to their son in the spring of 2010, and she would name him John. And that brings us to our final story. There is a specific kind of person who, when asked to describe a place that has killed multiple people, calls it beautiful. Agnes Milowka was that kind of person. She called Tank Cave a submerged labyrinth near Mount Gambier in South Australia, whose walls she once described as, quote, quite soft and squishy, which means that large chunks of the roof rain down on you as you exhale and the visibility is quickly reduced to 0, unquote, the crowning jewel of the region. And she called its passages, quote, a spider web gone wild, unquote. And she said this with evident delight. The danger and the beauty were not, for Agnes, in tension with each other. They were the same thing. Now, Agnes was born on December 23, 1981 in Poland and grew up in Melbourne, which goes some way toward explaining the particular combination of European intensity and Australian physical fearlessness that defined her. And she was small, dark-haired, precise, and relentlessly curious in the way that certain people are curious, where curiosity isn't a personality trait so much as a governing philosophy. And she held degrees in maritime archaeology, marketing, and history. And she was an underwater photographer whose images had appeared alongside National Geographic productions in the Bahamas. And she held the female cave dive penetration record for Australia, just an extremely impressive woman. And at this point in her life, she was 29 years old. And people who knew her described her as a person who was simultaneously warm and completely uninterested in doing anything by half measures. And she wrote about cave diving with a precision and candor that is rare in any extreme sport, as most practitioners of dangerous hobbies tend toward either bravado or clinical understatement when describing what they do. But Agnes wrote about it in the way a person writes about something they love and have thought about seriously and are not interested in misrepresenting for the sake of anyone's comfort. And she described the fear, and she described the beauty. And she described the specific particular quality of being alone in a submerged cave with zero visibility and the knowledge that the exit is somewhere in that dark ahead of you. And the only thing standing between you and dying there is the quality of your own training and the steadiness of your own mind. Just so poetic. And she would write, quote, "You can panic and die, give up and die, or control your thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and give yourself the best chance of coming out alive," unquote. So she wrote that, and she truly did believe it. And she had presumably lived it on dives where things had not exactly gone according to plan, which in cave diving is not a rare occurrence, but a routine one that separates the people who come home from people who don't. And she also worked as a stunt double on a major motion picture about cave divers dying underground. Sanctum was James Cameron's 3D underwater thriller released in Australia in January of 2011, and the premise was not subtle. A cave diving expedition in a remote South Pacific system goes catastrophically wrong during a flash flood, and the survivors have to navigate miles of submerged, unmapped passages to find an exit before they drown. So it was the kind of film that required people who could actually dive, like really dive, not just look convincing in shallow water. And Agnes was exactly the kind of person that search led to. So she worked on the production as a stunt diver and technical consultant, and she was very proud of it. And it was, in its way, a kind of official recognition of what she had spent years building, the expertise, the credentials, the physical capability that made her the right person for the job. And the film was dedicated to Wes Skiles. Now, Wes Skiles was a legend, a Florida-based cave diver, underwater filmmaker, and National Geographic explorer who had spent decades documenting the underwater cave systems of Florida and the Caribbean, and who was, by most accounts, one of the most gifted visual storytellers the sport had ever produced. And he and Agnes actually worked together. And he was, in the community, one of those figures whose presence had always seemed permanent. The kind of person whose death you don't anticipate because they seem too fundamental to the landscape to disappear from it. But Wes Skiles would die on July 21st, 2010, during an open ocean photo dive off the coast of Florida. And he was 52. And the cause was accidental drowning. So he would die in the water he had spent his life in, doing the work he had spent his life doing, and the cave diving world lost something it is still, in certain quiet conversations, trying to account for. So the movie Sanctum was released in theaters in the United States on February 4th, 2011, and it premiered in Australia on February 3rd, 2011. And the dedication to Wes Skiles appeared on screen in front of audiences that included, in at least some theaters, people who had known him. And Agnes was there, and she had just finished working on a film about the thing she loved, dedicated to a friend she had lost, and the year was new. But unfortunately, she would only have a few weeks left. So Tank Cave sits near Mount Gambier in the southeast corner of South Australia, in a part of the country where the landscape is green and pastoral and deceptively gentle. Nothing like the red dirt drama of the interior. And the cave entrance is marked by a water tank sitting on the surface above it, which is how it got its name, and which is one of the less romantic origin stories in Australia speleology. And below the tank, of 7 kilometers of submerged passages carved through limestone by the same ancient hydrological processes that created the entire network of underwater caves threading through the region's aquifer. Now, the water is clear and is cold, and the maximum depth is modest by extreme diving standards, roughly 20 meters, and it is, by the metrics that technical divers use to assess difficulty, not an especially deep cave. And depth in cave diving is only one of several ways a place can kill you. The others include complexity, silt, restriction, and distance from exit. Now, Tank Cave has all 4 in abundance. Its passages branch and rebranch and intersect in a 3-dimensional maze that Agnes herself described as a spiderweb gone wild. And its walls are soft enough that a single exhaled breath aimed at the ceiling dislodges material that hangs in the water like smoke, reducing visibility from meters to centimeters in seconds. And it is the kind of cave that experienced divers navigate by feel and by memory and by the physical guideline they run from the entrance. And that kills people when any one of those 3 things fails. Horrifying. Now, Agnes was diving with a group that day, and the dive began without incident. But at some point during the penetration, she encountered a tight restriction, a narrowing in the passage too small for 2 divers to navigate together. And this is routine in cave diving, and the protocol is established. And one diver investigates, and the other just waits. So Agnes told her buddy she was going to check it out. So she went ahead, but unfortunately, she wouldn't come back. And the search that followed covered the navigable sections of Tank Cave systematically, and her body would be found approximately 600 meters from the entrance in a tight section of the system, and her tanks were empty. And this is the best reconstruction of what happened, and it is a reconstruction built from the physical evidence of where she was found and how much air she had remaining. And that is that she became disoriented in silted out visibility, lost track of the guideline or was unable to reach it, and ran out of air before she could find her way back. 600 meters from the entrance, in a cave she knew so well, and in a cave she had described in her own writing with precision and care and full awareness of exactly how it could kill you. And Dr. Richard Harris, the South Australian cave diver and anesthetist who would, 7 years later, devise and execute the anesthesia plan that saved 12 Thai boys from the Tam Long Cave, was a close friend of Agnes Milowka. And he was part of the team that went in to Tank Cave to bring her out. And he said very little publicly about that retrieval. And honestly, some things don't need elaboration. And the cruelty and the timing is the thing that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. And not just the fact of her death, cave diving does kill people, and Agnes knew this better than almost anyone and wrote about it with clear eyes, but the specific, almost literary arrangement of events in the weeks surrounding it. A film about divers dying underground, released across Australia in January, dedicated to her deceased friend. Agnes, alive, having just finished working on it, the year stretching out ahead of her, and then 24 days after that premiere, she died in a cave in silted out water in a tight restriction in a manner so close to the scenarios depicted in the film she had just worked on that the coincidence feels less like a coincidence and more like something a novelist would be told to cut from being too on the nose. Because she had written in the same body of clear-eyed prowess about the sport she loved, saying, quote, "No one wants to die, but there are risks involved in cave diving. To me, the risks are worth it," unquote. And what she meant, and what the full body of her writing makes plain, is not that she was indifferent to danger or reckless with her life. She was neither. She was methodical and trained and genuinely expert. What she meant was something more considered than that, something closer to a philosophical position about what a life is for and what it means to do work that matters in conditions that demand everything you have. And she had found her place, the underwater caves of southern Australia, the Bahamas, the systems she had penetrated further than any woman before her. And she had found her community in Wes Skiles and Richard Harris, and the loose international network of people who go into the earth and breathe underwater and come back with photographs and maps and stories. And she had found her voice in the writing and the photography and the film work. And she was 29 years old, and the work was just beginning. And the cave has been dived since, because people still go to Tank Cave, and they run their guidelines from the entrance and breathe carefully and keep their fins off the floor so the silt stays settled. And at some point during the dive, in some narrow section of some branching passage in the spider web gone wild, they are in the same darkness Agnes was in when the visibility went to zero and the exit disappeared. But that is Agnes's story. My heart goes out to all of these families. And I mean, a lot of people heavily make fun of cave diving and spelunking and even rock climbing and skydiving and all these types of hobbies that most people are too afraid to do. But I honestly, I don't know. I mean, you can choose not to do them, but I don't fault people that do these things because it makes them feel alive. And obviously, we wish they were still with us, but I don't think any of them would have it any other way. I don't think any of them would never cave dive again. I think all of them would still be cave diving or spelunking today if they had made it back. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was kind of I'm supposed to do more fun videos on Saturdays, but I dived, if you will, into a rabbit hole, into a cave, if you will, of these types of stories, and I thought I would share a few of them that I was researching. So let me know what you guys think of this video. If you have any other topics of this kind that you want me to talk about, to recount other stories, let me know down below. I always read the comments, and until next time, I will see your beautiful face. All right, stay safe out there.